Hello, it's me again. I want to make a quick video basically just talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition because it's been a week or so since I completed Fall of Plaguestone, which is one of the modules for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and wanted to give my thoughts on it because whilst I really do like the system, I have a lot of gripes with it, and I really wanted to just go through the system and really break down what I like and what I dislike about the system, what I think could be improved, and where I think this game could, and what kind of people would really like this game. So let me just break down what Pathfinder 2nd Edition is. So Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the sequel to Pathfinder. Pathfinder was a free Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 extension. It was an expansion, but an extension. It was its own rules and stuff like that were very heavily inspired by 3.5 to the point that you can take something from 3.5 and move it over to Pathfinder no problems. And over time, obviously, with Dungeons & Dragons going into 4th edition, which universally a lot of people disliked, Pathfinder 3.5 started to get a lot of traction, but it carried a lot of bloat because obviously it had been out for so long, to the point that, a do-over was really needed. So in the wake of obviously Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition blowing up, Pathfinder 2nd edition is now onto the scene, basically with a brand new coat of paint. I haven't played 3.5 or Pathfinder 1st edition, so but I have played Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, so I can really see this as being like a response to 5th edition. And what it does is very different and really tries to kind of improve upon what 5th edition does, whilst also being very much like Pathfinder. Pathfinder 2nd edition is a response not only to 5th edition, but also kind of trying to keep the tradition of Pathfinder 1st edition. And overall, I think it works, but it's definitely not a game for me. I think a lot of people will probably come to that conclusion as well, because I think it does have some issues. But let me just go into what the game does really well first, and then go obviously into what I wish could be changed. The first thing I should really say is that the game has lots of options. So one of the best parts about this game is that it has so many different options that are really fun and flavorful. And not only that, they all work into the mechanics of the game as well. So when you make a character, you choose your ancestry or race, and then your background and your class, and you then obviously have lots of different options. You got your dwarves and your elves, and you also have goblin, which I really like the fact that you have goblin from first as a base ancestry. But every single time you choose like your ancestry or background or your class, you always get an option or a feature. Features are in 5th edition, but they're not very, they're pretty much an optional rule, but features essentially are different ways for you to customize your character, and they give benefits to certain like stats and roles and whatnot. Every single time you level up, you get a feature. So from the start of the game, you have features for your ancestry, features for your background, and features for your class. And every single time you level up, you get new features as you go along according to those 3 options that you chose at level 1. And what this leads to is that, for example, if you have 2 fighters at level 1, they are going to be very different characters depending on what feats they choose. And this is different from 5th edition, where basically if you chose 2 fighters or have a party of 2 fighters, they are going to be very similar. There's not a lot that's going to be, besides from weapon choice, and like background and race, they're going to be very samey. But with Pathfinder 2nd edition, there's more of a chance of them being very different characters with very different skill sets, and that's very fun. That's a very it basically means is that what the character that you build is your own, and the character that you eventually, get to know over the course of a whole campaign is going to be very different from someone else's character, and there's a very unlikely chance that you're going to end up with a character that is completely the same. So, and there's also a lot of different flavorful options for you to choose, and like I said, they all work into the mechanics of the game. You have one of my favorites personally is the monk. The monk gets stances that they can use in combat and switch in and out of, which one will favor more leg attacks and kicks and instead of punching. One will allow claws, and you can start doing claw damage and whatnot. And you can also switch in and out of these different things, and it's really fun and really flavorful as well to make a character that is always stance changing or uses different stances and different fighting styles. And yeah, that's not even getting into the ancestries and backgrounds even. And every class is like that basically you always have loads of different options to choose from and ways to customize how your class plays. And it's a far cry from obviously 5th edition, where it's just the subclass, and once you choose a subclass, that's all you get. That is all the options you get. You're on this narrow path essentially with just that subclass, and it leads to the situations where you're just stuck with, you don't really get to choose much of how your character plays. And you may not like a certain class feature or subclass feature that your character has in 5th edition, and you can't change it. It's stuck like that. The fighter, if you go for the champion, for example, like you're just stuck with everything the champion gets. Whereas in Pathfinder 2nd edition, it's like, oh, I can choose to have, specialize in shields if I wanted to, or archery, and there'll be different features to choose for that. And and that's always at every level, and it feels not only very flavorful and really brings your character into its own in terms of role playing, but it also works like in terms of when you comes down to dice rolling. And I think there's a good balance there that needs to happen for people to really engage with the game. Like, it's fun and dandy that your character uses pots and pans, but if it functionally works the same as a guy with a sword, it just feels kind of cheap in a way. It doesn't really feel like your character is doing anything unique besides from what you're describing. But in Pathfinder 2nd edition, if you go to the advanced player guide, there's the option for improvised weapon master that can really allow you to expand in that direction if you really want to. And that's a super fun way to play the game. If you want to use improvised weapons and be known as the guy who can pick up a bar stool and use it as a melee weapon, like, go for it. And I think just having the fact that you have all these options that are really fun and interesting, but they also work, is something that I really like about this system. And what I also like is also the action economy. So the action economy in the game is essentially you have free actions. You also have a free action and a reaction. And I think not only is this, even though this game is way more complicated than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, it is just so much easier to explain the free actions. When you get into 5th edition, you have an action, a bonus action, but you can't do a bonus action and an action in that order. You have to do an action and then the bonus action, and like, do you even have a bonus action? What counts as a bonus action? Is this a bonus action? It just feels a little messy in my mind, and I've always had to, like, whenever I explain the game to people who have never played Dungeons & Dragons, none of them really understand it, I feel, or like they're always kind of like searching up and down their character sheet and they're going, do I even have a bonus action? Pathfinder, you have free actions. What do you want to do with it? You can move, you can attack, you can, throw things, you can interact with options and raise shields and tumble through enemies and trip them up and feint and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, there's a lot more tactical choices that you can basically make with free actions instead of just the regular move and action. And also, because you can multi-attack from level 1, it means that martial classes are always going to be, have a lot more choices of how they approach things as well. And it just leads to combat I think is just way more interesting and just way more kind of liberating, and also just easier to explain, because it is just like certain, like, even though some things take up 2 actions and free actions like spells are universally 2 actions and stuff like that, you can figure out, there's this resource management of like, okay, I have free actions, but there's this problem here, like how am I going to solve all these problems whilst putting myself not in danger? And you can really see people's, really think about what they do instead of just walk up to guy and then just punch. And I find it just to be a lot more liberating, a lot simpler to explain, and just much more interesting as a action economy than 5th edition D&D. And personally for me, I think the free action economy system is possibly my favorite out of all the games I've played. I would prefer if more games had it. Honestly, it's one of those things that I just really like. I think it's just one of the better ways of dealing with combat that I've seen, and definitely the best thing about this game is that free action economy for combat. That's in my personal opinion, besides the choices obviously. But that being said, I do have a lot of gripes with this game. So one of my biggest gripes is the way that criticals are basically dealt with. And so I should explain the dice system in the game. So it's a D20 system, but essentially your AC will go up as you play the game. So it'll go above 20, which may be quite odd for people who have played 5th edition, but your AC will go up above into the 40s in this game. And so will also all your other stats. So you get proficiencies with different things. Like, for example, when you are trained proficiency in the game, you get a +2. When you're legendary trained with skill, it gets to +10. And thus you can see that, like, dice rolls can go upwards of 50 even. Like, if you are a legendary level 20 and get a 20 on the dice, it'll go up to 50 easy. Like, the dice numbers get pretty high in this game. But one thing that the game does is that if you get 10 above the DC, so if your DC is 25 and you get a 35, you have a critical success. And depending on the roll, that could lead to, certain outcomes that are way better. So for healing, for example, if you do a treat medicine check, which is, one of the ways that you recover health in this game, because resting doesn't recover health, or that much health at all, you essentially get double the health from that roll, and thus, critical successes are a must to have. If you go into combat and get a critical success, you get double damage, and that's pretty high. That, like, it's not just extra dice, it's double damage. So if you hit a D12, like a 12 and a crit, that's 24 damage. Like, that's a lot of damage, and that's not even getting into modifiers and stuff like that. And this is all the way from level 1, by the way. And the problem is that this leads to combat that is not only pretty difficult, but also can be unfair and anticlimactic. So one thing that I disliked was that basically boss encounters I felt just got rinsed. Characters would just get crits and just rinse some of the boss characters I had. It made some encounters just laughably easy just because of just a lucky crit. But then it also made other encounters just incredibly unfair because you just get into a situation where you get one crit and it's like 3/4 of your health gone or you're just dead. Like the first encounter, one of the first encounters we got into was with a boar, and it hit the sorcerer once, and the boar had a +10 to strike, and the sorcerer had like an AC of, I think it was pretty low. It was like 16 or something like that, or maybe lower, and it just led to the sorcerer getting one tapped on a dice roll of a 17. That crit, and that did like an unbelievable amount of damage and killed him in one. He managed to get through death saves and stuff like that, but like it was just one of those moments where I was just like, the boar ended up being more of a threat to the party at level 1 than the final boss did. That's how much the crits in this game can really swing fights, and it leads to fights that you would want to be more like impactful from a story perspective, being kind of anticlimactic and just kind of like, you know, they just get so done and dusted with one lucky crit that it just ends up in these situations where it's like, how? Like you just hit once and then the whole life bar just gets wiped away, and it's just, like I said, it just feels anticlimactic, and it just also feels unfair from a player's perspective when it happens to them. Like one lucky dice roll, and you're just like, you can kind of just see the, you know, players just being like, oh, for God's sake, like, you know, half my health just got deleted because of one lucky roll, and there's nothing I can really do about it. And yeah, it leads to a lot of situations where I just felt like it led to unfair and anticlimactic situations. The other thing I don't like about the crits is that because every skill check has a crit, mostly every skill has a crit success effect. It leads to basically doing a skill, because there's so many different specific skills that have their own different success, failures, critical success and failures. Something like high jump in this game, I think, is probably the worst. You have doing a high jump and doing a jump are two different things. Like if you want to do a long jump, it's this completely different skill check. If you want to do a vertical jump, it's a completely different skill check that I just think it's just really precise. Like I'm reading it here, like you make a vertical jump, you make a DC 30 athletics check and to increase your height of your jump, and you know, if you critically succeed, it goes up by 8 feet, or the maximum vertical distance is 5 feet, or horizontal is 10 if it's critical. And like, you know, if it's an increase of like maximum vertical distance of 5, it's a success and stuff like that. And it's just like, it's so precise that you just kind of wonder to yourself, like, why? Like, you're not going to remember all that. There's just no way. And the thing is that like, this is for climbing, this is for swimming as well. They all have their own like crit, success, failure, critical failure, and it's for every single check. And there's no way, I think, unless you really dedicate yourself to learning this game and really learning which ones are really common, you're not going to remember all of these on the top of your head, and you're going to have to refer to the book. And referring to the book for certain skill checks is fine, but I just feel like, you know, you already have the sample DCs. The sample DCs, I think, work fine for the game. So why can't the critical success be like you gain an extra 8 feet jump for a critical success. Like most people are just going to be like, you want to just jump up a wall. It's like, how high is it? It's about 10 feet. You're going to need a DC of 20 to do it. Fine. Do I fail? Do I critically fail? Do I climb it? Instead of being like, oh, you got a critical success on this 10-foot wall, you now get to do an extra 8 feet. And it's just like, it does that for so many different skill checks that I was just reading through it. And I was just like, why? Like, why can't it be just, I would rather just give a person a hero point or like something else, like an opportunity. Like, oh, if you succeed this role, the next person who does it, you can help them to do it automatically and stuff like that. I'd rather that instead of just, having to, refer to a table of like climbing distances and stuff like that. It just feels too precise to the point that the level of precision does feel a little unnecessary in some moments. But the one thing I also think, like for something like earn income, I think the critical successes are fine and all that. It's just the skill checks, I think, get a little bit too much for me personally. Like I rather just be able to call if it's an easy task or a hard task to do, and just deal with it that way instead of having to, refer to, if you don't stride, if 10 feet and stuff like that. It's just, it just feels a little bit too much for me personally. What also makes it difficult to play and run is the fact that everything in this game also has, I don't know what it is, but it feels like every single time I had to look something up, there was always something else to look up straight after that. And the reason for that is because the game uses a kind of the traits and conditions. So essentially there's a lot of uniformity in terms of like certain things having the same traits and same conditions applied to them. And what this leads to is that everything that is like a different, conditions, different traits are all on different pages or all on a separate part of the book. So when you go to look up what splash, that you go and pick up a firebomb, right? You throw the firebomb, it says it has the splash trait. You have to go then to a different page to look up what the splash trait does. And that seems all fine and dandy, but it's like every single thing has this. And it's like, it gets ridiculous like sometimes, where it's just like, I cannot, look up. Like, if I want to look up a spell and what it does, I have to also look up what the condition it applies, and then go to that page, go to the conditions and see what the condition does. And these are all very, like, they're not just like -2 this, -2 that. They're pretty precise in what they want to do. Like, there's, -2 to all rolls in the very specific, like, perception, reaction, or reflex and stuff like that. And then all it amounts to in some cases is just a -2, and it's just like, why is there so many conditions, and why are they so just? Why can't when I want to look up a spell, why can't I just have it all there, right? Like, why can't I just have what it does on the page? Like, it does a persistent fire damage. I didn't have to look up what persistent fire does. And it also has a DC flat check at the end of the turn to see if you're on fire and stuff like that. And it's like, like, why can't it just be on the spell? Like, I guess it's, to make, certain things like the persistent fire and persistent ice damage, if it does occur, to be very uniform and have the same rules. And if you know how persistent damage works in the first place, you can just go back to playing the game normally because you know how it works. But it's just for every single role or every single thing in this book has like a separate page that you have to look up after that. Good lord, there's so many and they do so precise things that it was just kind of like, this is cool, but oh my god, like it feels like sometimes there's so many different moving parts and so many different things that it gets a little ridiculous, and it doesn't help that trying to look up these rules in the first place, like when I have to Google it to figure it out, yeah, it gets a little ridiculous. And it definitely felt like, my players did notice that I was struggling to really get my head around the rules. So thank God I had players that were just ultra supportive and ultra, willing to work with, my lack of GM skill, let's just say. But yeah, it just felt like every single time I was trying to look something up, it was just this, hunt. And it was always something else to refer to, something else to look up. And it can't just work. There's always there's very precise numbers involved to a lot of these checks, and very precise things that the game wants you to do. And it felt like sometimes at first, it felt like, oh, if I wanted to find something, there's a table for that. And I love the fact that it was like, if I wanted to look up how hard a certain object is, I could do that. If I want to look up how much this item would cost, there's a price for that. And it's really nice to have. But as I went along, I was kind of thinking to myself, like, why can't I just make it up? Like, why can't I just wing it? And I felt this kind of like I had to refer to the book way more, because it was like, oh, if I just wing it, there was going to be some separate rule in the book on this far side page that says otherwise. And it was just like, it got very tiring after a while. That was just like, I can't just pick up the book, flick through it, understand what the rules are, and just get the general gist of how everything should work. And I think a lot of it was maybe a little bit of naivety on my side, and maybe, wanting things to be a little easier. But it felt like, if I wanted to do a certain check, it was always something that I had to be very precise on and had to refer to. And, I think in some cases it could be streamlined. It could probably be streamlined a lot better. I like there's lots of options of, tackling problems and stuff like that, but it gets too much sometimes. And yeah, I think that's the major fault of the game. It's just way too complicated in some sections, and it just doesn't seem to get way too precise and way too number crunchy, to the point that for me personally, I would like to see things streamlined. Like, for example, just making crits just be less intensive. Like, instead of it being, I do double damage, I do maybe something else instead. And just making the game just a little bit easier to run would really go a long way, instead of having, all these different, critical successes, and having all these different critical failures, and having all these different traits, and having all these different conditions that you have to refer to and learn as as sort of a language for the game. And it bogged the game down way too much, to the point that when we were coming to the conclusion of the game, it led to, a player just one-shotting the creature with a spell, and it was just like, okay. And then it just ended really anticlimactically, and, yeah, it just didn't go the way I planned it to, and it kind of sucked in some respect that it didn't go the way I hoped it went. I wish it had a little bit more impact as an ending of in particular, but that's just the nature of the beast, isn't it? So yeah, I just wish the game was a little easier to run, just a little bit easier to find things, less conditions and like all that kind of jazz. I'd wish that crits were I think crits needed to instead Like the Alien RP, I think, has like sort of a similar system with like critical successes, allowing you to do different things. Like, for example, if you do a certain check and you get a critical success, you don't have to do the same check again for the similar task. Like, I think that's like a fine kind of solution to the problem in some ways. And I also just think like just tone down some of the difficulty. Like, the difficulty of the game is just gets a little bit too much for players, I think, and also just means that fights just swing heavy. Like, it could be way too easy or way too hard very easily, and it also doesn't help that Fall of Plaguestone, I believe, was written before the rules were really finalized, which definitely shows. Like, some of the writing in it was like, oh, the enemies are screened, and there's no mention of what screened it is or anything like that, which is okay, sure. And then also just the enemies just doing just plus 10 to hit. Like, the boar should never do plus 10 to hit at level 2. That was just ridiculous in general if they managed to crit. I do feel like I may not understand the game that well, and that maybe there is something that I could have done to run the game better, but I don't know. I feel like from a lot of the complaints and a lot of the criticism that this game has, I feel like I fell into the trappings that a lot of other people did, which is why I'm a little bit more confident to, state my opinion here. But I'll leave it at that, really. I think, honestly, I would love to see Pathfinder 2 a little bit more streamlined for me personally. If I could, I would love to go back through the rules and stuff like that and really just condense it down to what really works, and really just make it just a funner game to run, I think. I felt it was just way too clunky and way too chunky as a game, that running it was just, I never felt 100% like I was on top of it, and maybe I never will be, but hey, who knows? I may run this game in the future for people if they really want me to, but for the time being, I think I'm pretty good with where Pathfinder, or with my, I'm getting to the end. My throat is hurting. I've been talking for about 40 minutes or so, and also been doing multiple takes, so I'll leave it there. But what do you guys think of Pathfinder? I forgot the order of it. It'll be on screen. But Pathfinder 2nd edition, I do really like. I do prefer it to 5th edition, but I just believe there's some middle ground in between 5th edition and Pathfinder that I would really like. And maybe I'll find it. I'll have to take some of your suggestions. Leave your favorite RPs, fantasy or otherwise, in the comments below if you really want to. And I'll see you guys very, very soon. Later. I don't know why. I feel like I've been watching too much of the Daily Dose of the Internet and not doing anything with my life.